Good evening, folks. I'd like to welcome everybody here to this summer session institute. Our keynote address tonight will be a report on research that is currently in progress by our LIFS fellows and research associates. So we're very, very excited for them to be reporting on a study that they've engaged in on the process which underlies the creation of trauma-sensitive schools. I would like to welcome everybody. First, ask you please to keep your mics muted to the extent possible, unless you are speaking or have a question, in order to save bandwidth. I'd also like to recognize the presence of Patricia Crane, our Associate Dean, Merlin Mayhew, our Assistant Director, and our research associates will introduce themselves in due course. But we'd like to begin by turning things over to our lead clinical faculty member, Joe Restuccia, who has a few words to say about a colleague of ours recently lost to us. Joe.
Thanks, Al. I have some sad news to share with the LIFS community. My good friend and colleague of 25 years, Susan Cole, passed away on May 1st of this year. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't mention in remembering Susan some of her achievements, including being the founding director of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, senior project director at Mass Advocates for Children, a clinical instructor at the Harvard University School of Law. You know, Susan and her team were responsible for a number of important pieces of educational legislation, including the Safe and Supportive Schools legislation and its accompanying grant programs. You in the LIFS community may know her best as the lead author of Helping Traumatized Children Learn, volumes 1 and 2. You know, her accomplishments are many, and I could spend the whole time talking about them, but I want to talk about Susan the educator and Susan the visionary. Susan was a licensed special educator before she took to the law. She taught a moderate special needs classroom in Watertown under Jim Early. Her teaching experience was always a core part of who she was, constantly inquiring to better understand, inquiry from a humble and help me understand perspective. In addition, she was a true visionary leader, convening a conference to discuss the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning in 1995. Let me put that date in a little perspective. 1995 is 3 years before the publication of the original ACE study and 6 or 7 years before the first real findings linking neurobiology with traumatic experience. Additionally, the first volume of Helping Traumatized Children Learn, published in 2005, was geared specifically for educators and was the first work to thoroughly articulate the connection between traumatic experience and student learning, and continues to be a core reference in the field to this day. Susan understood that while individual supports were important, effectively addressing systemic issues such as traumatic experience required a whole school effort, and pushed to define the concept of trauma-sensitive schools and how to create them. She was always focused not just on identifying the issue, but also developing useful approaches to addressing the needs of schools and students. Shortly after the publication of Helping Traumatized Children Learn, what we know as the Purple Book, in 2005, Susan reached out to Mary Beth Curtis at Lesley University to discuss teacher training. When it became clear from discussions at Lesley that the required teacher training curriculum imposed by the state was too full for another major topic area, Susan wholeheartedly supported Lesley University in the creation of continuing education graduate courses for practicing professionals. If you will, these courses were the beginning of and resulted in the creation of the LIFT's Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity. Thanks, Susan. Appreciate that. Susan's recent work looked to elevate the voices of educators, students, and families to make them a meaningful part of school reform. Susan Cole was a visionary educational reformer whose ideas and thinking were way ahead of their time in 1995, her time. In 1995, no one was talking about trauma and learning. And to this day, few people truly comprehend the need for the systemic change that she has been putting forward for decades at this point. Her visionary work has impacted teacher education, school reform, and is a central component of the effort to make understanding traumatic experience and its impacts on student learning a necessary component of every teacher's practice. When I think of the conversation around the current pandemic and the central role trauma plays in those conversations, I cannot help but reflect on how far the issue has come since 1995 and the legacy left by Susan's vision. Susan was my friend, a visionary leader, and a passionate educator. We will miss her. Thank you, and now I want to turn it over to Leah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are so glad that you were here. Before I begin, was there anybody else who wanted to, Patricia, anything you wanted to say before we get going? Okay. As soon as Julie is sharing the slideshow, we will get started. Once again, we are just so glad that you're here and excited to share our research with you. I will also preface this by saying I have a 1-year-old running around with me, so just bear with me, please. So the title of our presentation today is actually the foundations of our research. We are investigating the trauma-sensitive school process, the process of creating a trauma-sensitive school. And there's a whole group of us doing this. My name is Leah. I'm one of the research fellows, along with Juliandra Morgan, who is also here. And we were joined by an incredible team of 6 research associates, Katie De La Rosa, Alicia Gray, Alexa Kirby, Mark St. Pierre, Nancy Schneider, and Eldine Montevan, who is here. You guys can all give waves. And we have been doing this work over the past year together, which has just been such a fun way for us to do research. A little bit about the purpose of the study. So first and foremost, our purpose is to examine the experiences of educators in the process of creating trauma-sensitive schools. We were looking at the foundational elements, how they define success, and any barriers that they came across. We also want to provide some why behind this work, some of our heart behind it. And while the purpose of the research was, of course, to examine the experiences of educators, the impacts go a lot further, and our hearts for this work go a lot deeper. The impacts of trauma on behavior and cognition and development have been well-founded in the fields of social work and psychology, but it's only in more recent years that schools have begun to adopt this trauma-sensitive approach. And we're just lucky enough to be able to stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before and really laid the groundwork of this work, like Joe explained for us. This work is inherently disruptive. It challenges the status quo. It's often been undertaken by schools and districts without any real guidance or oversight, which means that success has really happened in silos. And we wanted to know, what exactly were they doing and how were they successful? The schools that have been doing this well, how did they walk this road? What were those foundational elements? How did they define success? What did they overcome? What barriers did they surmount? And furthermore, what similarities were there among the schools doing this work? Was there anything in common that they had in their experience? What can we learn from them collectively? And from that, we also just thought it would be helpful to define trauma. In recent years, definitely not in 1995, but I would say especially in the last year, trauma itself has become a buzzword, something that lots of people are talking about, but perhaps not necessarily talking about the same thing. So we provided 2 definitions here that the Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity often uses. The first is by Beverly James, and it's the overwhelming, uncontrollable experiences that psychologically impact victims by creating in them feelings of helplessness, vulnerability, loss of safety, loss of control. The second is by Samsa, and it says that trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. What I want us to notice here is that both of these definitions highlight the experience of the individual, which means it's not our job to define or tell somebody else what is traumatizing, but to honor their response to any stimuli. And both of these definitions do that for us. So just so you know, when we say trauma throughout this presentation, this is what we're talking about. The response of students to anything that has made them feel like they were unsafe or vulnerable, out of control. And I think we can all agree that this past year and a half has likely invoked those feelings in many of us. Of course, the purpose of our research was determining a process for becoming a trauma-sensitive school. But the real why behind this work was our deep belief that it matters. It's because we care about kids and teachers and schools and families. We care about the equitable access to education. We believe in learning environments that combat the impacts of trauma on learning. We want to see how it was done well. Education is urgent, and now more than ever, there is a need for creating learning environments that are safe and supportive, and in which students can truly engage and access the learning. On this slide here, you'll see that we have seen the evidence that this works from some of these schools that are doing this work. This is an example from one of the flagship districts who has been implementing trauma-sensitive practices. And the findings among these individual schools are consistent. Those who work towards trauma sensitivity with fidelity, they see their academic scores increase. They see their referrals for behavior decrease. They see teachers reporting higher satisfaction. They see children reporting higher perceptions of safety. We had this preliminary finding to spur on our research and validate the why behind why this was such a salient topic of study.
So as far as the logistics of our research went, we really looked at a wide range of issues kind of that sort of went on around the research itself. In order to do research at Lesley, we needed to submit an application to the Institutional Review Board. So we wrote it, submitted it, revised it, and then resubmitted it. So additionally, when we were scheduling interviews with our subjects, we were scheduling interviews with school administrators during the re-entry period just following the COVID epidemic. So administrators were scrambling to get their resources together, to get their personnel situated, to transition from online learning to in-person learning. So it was a busy time for everybody, and those logistics were a consideration. Our team, whom you've met, in addition to the associates and the fellows, you met Joe and Sal already. Frequently Merlin as well, and Patricia participated in bi-weekly Zoom meetings during which we discussed any ongoing issues, any meetings that the fellows and the associates had had. And then while all that was going on, Leah and I were meeting with the associates to discuss our research methods, our questions, our focus, and then we were coding our interviews. So there was kind of a lot going on behind the scenes. almost all aspects of our research were collaborative. We learned about consensual qualitative research together. We developed purpose, we developed questions, interview protocol, transcripts, and we did all of our coding as a team. There were a couple of tasks that just Leah and I performed, specifically the interviews with our school administrators. We conducted those one-to-one on Zoom. Leah transcribed her interviews and I transcribed mine. And then we, in a kind of second phase of coding, we broke into small groups and did our coding in smaller groups rather than as an 8-person group. Our objectives for this research were primarily to investigate the process of becoming a trauma-sensitive school. What did school administrators see as the main components of their trauma-sensitive school journey? We really wanted to understand their lived experience. We wanted to kind of jump in to their process. And we really want down the line to be able to help other districts engage with that trauma-sensitive learning process, to use what we've learned from the administrators and staff at these districts we interviewed this year, to kind of help new districts jump into trauma-sensitive learning. We used consensual qualitative research as our methodology. As I discussed, we gathered our data from school administrators, and discussed their natural setting. We really wanted to know what was happening as they saw it in their context. We didn't want to kind of impose our information on an existing theory. We really wanted to use our data to develop and build our own theoretical model. We're interested in constructing meaning. We really want to know what the administrators and the personnel experience and feel, and we really want to understand their whole experience. Our research questions, we wanted to know what the foundational elements of a trauma-sensitive school or program are. What is the process that the administrators see as becoming trauma-sensitive for them? How do they define success? How do they know when they've either met their objectives or are meeting their objectives in a more trauma-sensitive language? And what barriers did they encounter to becoming trauma-sensitive?
All right, and now for the interview questions. So I have to tell you that conducting these interviews was like a dream come true. This was so much fun, and if you could invite me to do anything in the world, it would be sit down and pick the brains of leaders who are doing this trauma-sensitive work well. So what we asked them, we kept it pretty brief. We wanted it to be open-ended. We didn't want to, guide the conversation in a way that would lead to similar responses. We wanted our participants to just tell us their lived experience. So first, we simply asked what their role in the school was. We asked how their school became interested in trauma-sensitive work. And then we asked what the most important elements were. From there, we asked about their barriers, what they had faced, how they overcame them. And then we asked them to describe their success. This was such a fun one to ask. What are you doing well? And better yet, how do you know? How do you measure success? What makes you think you're doing well in that area? And then, of course, we asked what areas they were still working on. That is a tricky question to ask in the middle of a pandemic, but we asked. And it was just fascinating hearing these incredible leaders' responses. Every one of these participants were educational leaders who had led their school through this work with trauma-sensitive learning as the foundation. And finally, we just asked them if there's anything else they wanted to tell us, any stories, anything that we missed, anything we didn't ask about. And those elicited some really fun responses as well.
So as I mentioned earlier, we use consensual qualitative research to conduct the entire research project. It's collaborative, and it's a method of assessing interview data, in this case, in which we went through each of the interviews and used these 3 CQR steps to code the interviews. And in order to code the interviews, generally, according to Hill and colleagues, 1997 and 2005 were kind of the 2 journal articles we used for our methods. There's a primary team that conducts the coding analysis. First, each member reads the interviews separately and examines the information. We get together and discuss the ideas until we come up with domains, which are kind of broad topic areas used to kind of segment the interview data. And then in subsequent meetings, we developed core ideas, which are sort of broad summaries of the domains that I just discussed. Subsequent to that, we used in vivo software to cross-analyze, and we're sort of in that process now also. So our software is able to kind of cross-analyze and use all of the codes and domains we generated to determine similarities among respondents and interviewees. Kind of the first step we used is to develop a mind map from our research questions in order to kind of ground us and allow us to narrow and create those domain areas that I just discussed. So this is the mind map we used.
And then we got to the fun part, which was analyzing the data. And I say fun because it was fun. It was also blood, sweat, and tears. But what we did was break up into 2 groups. So each of us fellows got 3 associates and got to torture them in 3-hour-long Zoom videos where we read through the entire transcripts, word for word, and we just labored over the coding. And this is where it was just so incredible to go back over those interviews with a fine-tooth comb and figure out what exactly we were seeing. And this work was exhaustive, but we came up with over 100 codes between the 2 groups. We kept identifying codes until we felt as though we had reached saturation, meaning we didn't think there was any code left unturned. We considered how each response to the interview question, we looked at every anecdote, every musing from that participant, and we determined how it could be coded into something meaningful. So just a few examples. We would find a line and highlight it and code it as professional development, or as teacher empowerment, or as resources, or as buy-in. And then we would see, okay, we have all these resources coded. We need to go back and actually double code those and say financial resources, time resources, human resources. And then from there, once each of our teams had done this for our interviews, we came back together as a whole group and saw what we had in common. And we've begun the process of figuring out how those individual 100 codes fit together. The individual codes naturally began to divide themselves into broader themes or core ideas. Just imagine it like sorting colors into buckets, right? All your blues go in one bucket, all your oranges go in another. We did the same thing, but with codes, like terms with like terms. And then we dug into those like terms to see how can these be described more broadly. I will tell you, we started with paper and pencil, putting these codes down in groups, and then figuring out if those groups made sense and what we could title them. At first, we came up with 3 really broad buckets of meaning. They were learning, understanding, and believing. Once those buckets of meaning had been determined, we then looked back at the data and the interviews to see how they revealed a process. So we had these general themes, but remember our initial question was, what is the process for creating a trauma-sensitive school? So we wanted to see how those buckets of meaning lended themselves through the data to reveal some kind of formalized process. And what we saw was that in each unique context, there was actually a similar process. Now, it's important to note these individuals worked completely separately. Different schools, different districts, they did not work together. I'm sure some of them know one another, but their work was individual. So it was really telling that there were patterns among each individual's process. We saw that there were things they all had in common, like having staff that was brought into the work and that believed in the trauma-sensitive practices. We saw that there was an importance on training, shared learning, either internally through professional development or externally through things like the Lesley Lifts courses. And then we saw engaging in practice. This was the day-to-day, the school-wide inner working of putting those beliefs and that understanding into practice. So we had developing a belief system, shared understanding, and then engaging in practice. And then, while we found that there were some important underpinnings to these main ideas, we couldn't omit things like dynamic learning. So that learning, that shared learning didn't just happen once. It was dynamic, it was ongoing. We saw that each of these schools had some process of identifying needs or priorities. We saw that communication was key in all of their experiences. We saw that reflecting and adjusting was critical in every one of their practices. You'll see these little baubles in the middle of the circle on your screen. And at first, we had aligned each of these smaller circles with one of the big buckets. But as we talked through it, we realized that to more accurately reflect the data, these middle codes, they're not stagnant. They float around. The dynamic learning is part of developing a belief system and the shared understanding and the engaging in practice. They float around and become part of each of those 3 larger buckets.
So as Leah suggested, our coding process was exhaustive, and kind of our guiding research methodology. Hill and colleagues discussed the need for not only consensus without bias, but consensus without groupthink. So our task was to be in a group and find ways of describing these interviews through codes, but at the same time to do our very best to eliminate our own biases and to kind of check in with each other around biases that we're perceiving in others, and also to eliminate a sort of what the authors called groupthink, which is to sort of have a kind of a dominant way of thinking, sort of overshadow the other participants. So we really checked in with ourselves to try to avoid those. And we did land on some key findings. Administrators really discussed connecting with a purpose to drive and support change. It really was about a bigger picture for most of the administrators. It included, always included students and staff and the school community itself and families. And so they really wanted to connect with a larger purpose. They really wanted to seek information and input from all of the involved stakeholders, staff, students, and families. Administrators that we spoke with weren't making unilateral decisions for the most part. They were really checking in with everybody. They wanted to create opportunities for communication and collaboration across all of those stakeholders. And they really needed to use resources creatively. Sometimes what they perceived as maybe not enough of something and too much of something else. So they really needed to be creative with their use. They really needed to find opportunities for themselves, for their staff, and for students and families to learn throughout all aspects of the change process. And they really sought community support throughout the change process. Really thoughtful work on the part of all of the administrators we spoke with. Administrators talked a lot about whole school and whole child and taking a holistic approach across the change process. Trauma-sensitive schools for these administrators included social emotional learning strategies, community building, trauma-sensitive processes with methodologies and materials kind of tailored toward their specific groups of students. Administrators needed to feel like everybody was on the same page and people were provided adequate professional development in order to be a part of the process. And so, all of the administrators we spoke with hadn't kind of just jumped in with both feet. They were really believers in this process. And like Leah showed earlier, some of their data really reflected that. Some of their school data really reflected that. We did participate in a NEPA conference. We have some very social media and visual presentation adept people on our team who provided some great work around the social media and the LIFTS Hub, which is a platform to provide resources for schools interested in this, in trauma-sensitive learning. And we are currently working on a proposal for the NEPA conference, New England Psychological Association conference in November. And we're putting a poster proposal together that'll be submitted this weekend.
So one of the questions that do come to mind is, how can these findings be applied more broadly? So the study on trauma-sensitive schools can be extended to include the creation of an equitable environment for all students. Trauma-sensitive practices offer a flexible framework and adaptability to both educators and school leaders. The practices do not require school labeling of students in order to have a better approach to equity. For example, English language learners and students with special needs, they are all included when discussing what it means to be a trauma-sensitive school.
Hi, so I'm Alicia Gray. I'm one of the research associates. And while our research didn't specifically ask questions related to COVID-19, every single participant brought up the pandemic and its impact on teaching and learning in the past year and a half. And school leaders expressed the need to be really flexible and adapt to meet the needs of their students and their staff and their communities. And they needed to be ready to pivot at a moment's notice. So just constantly adapting and constantly moving with that change. And an overwhelming trend that showed up in our interviews were schools that had established trauma-sensitive frameworks in place really felt more comfortable supporting their students throughout the pandemic and their community, their students' families, their staff. And they were better and faster able to adapt their curriculum and program for students virtually. One of our participants shared in their interview, I'm going to read a quote from them. They said, so when COVID hit that Thursday, it was the 12th, March 12th for us. That Friday, we had called out school for the students. And by that Monday, everyone was up and learning on that Monday. We had Chromebooks for students. We had systems in place already. Our teachers knew how to report things to counselors and deans, and we had things in place. So while it rocked a ton of schools, and believe me, it rocked us, it hasn't been easy. I think we'd have things that really helped us transition more easily to online learning and to supporting students who were struggling. And we had those relationships. The kids were reaching out when they needed help. So that's the quote from one of our participants. And we saw common quotes like this throughout all of our research data. So it's shown in that quote, and then in the additional interviews, some of the key takeaways related to the pandemic were the importance of having pre-established clear systems of communication in place between all sorts of different stakeholders, communications with students, communication with families and community members, communication among staff, protocols in place if a student is in need, in crisis, having some type of system that everyone is aware of that can translate in a lot of different settings was essential, as well as really having fostered relationships between staff and students, students and students, students or staff and staff. So just building those relationships and having those already established because of their implementation of the trauma sensitive framework was really beneficial when schools needed to transition into a virtual learning environment.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy Schneider, and I am one of the research associates. I would like to start by saying that it was a privilege, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be part of LIFT. As a research associate, I was part of an incredible team that performed different functions and had different responsibilities, which, as mentioned by Juliandra and Leah earlier, organizing and processing data, analyzing said data and reporting findings, etc. This experience not only allowed me to gain research experience and skills, but deepen my knowledge in research, trauma, and trauma-sensitive schools, which is so valuable to me.
Do we have any questions from any listeners at the moment?
Is it possible for you to stop sharing the screen?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. First of all, if I might say some words, let me thank the research associates for an absolutely wonderful presentation. You have all worked so hard to deepen your knowledge of trauma and learning, and also to deepen your knowledge of research, approaches to research. And I want to commend you. You've done a wonderful job. At the same time, I also want to thank Lesley University, Patricia as the Associate Dean, Amy Rutstein-Riley as the Interim Dean, Paul Nasso. Everybody has been so supportive and helpful to us in LIFTS as we ventured into this idea of having research fellows and devoting them to the Trauma and Learning Project. So I want to give a word of thanks to some of them who are with us tonight because they really enabled what you did. I'd like to ask whether, and this is for anybody, is there, as you relate some of the work that you've done to, for example, theories of change, school change, when you read people like Michael Fullen or even Peter Senge, are you seeing anything in the data that you are working on which you could say that this comports really nicely with the, I'm finding analogies in the work of Fullen and Senge and others in terms of what we've seen. Does anybody want to make any comments on that?
I really, I appreciate both Fullen and Senge's work a lot. And I'm so grateful to Michael Fullen for his, his work on the kind of his 6 aspects of change. And the one in particular that always strikes me is that he wants systems to love their people. And that really came out in this research. Our administrators love their people, and they make it a point to acknowledge their staff. And I think that's a big part of what makes this trauma-sensitive learning process successful, or at least makes it make sense for these administrators and their staff, is that they make an effort to include their staff, they make an effort to engage their staff, they make an effort to not just kind of issue dictates, but to take into account all of the needs of the staff, students, and families around them. So that's kind of one thing that resonates with me from at least Fullen. I don't know about anybody else.
I agree with you. I see, you know, we look at that precept where one of them says you should know yourself and you should know your context. You know, I saw that one of your themes that comes out is the theme of reflective practice. In other words, doing the work. All of the principals talked to how they had a leadership team, and decisions were made always in consultation with the leadership team. And there was this idea of always, you know, never being a trauma-sensitive school, but always becoming a trauma-sensitive school. And so this idea of ongoing reflective practice. And I was also struck by one of your main buckets, that the establishment and articulation of a belief system, and how well that seems to comport with the mental models segment in Senge's Water of Systems Change, that, you know, you have to change people's mindset. It's about developing a new mental model. And here, your interviewees were continuously emphasizing the idea of, oh, we have a common belief system. We had to change people's beliefs about how children learn or why they act out, that it wasn't just willful defiance or willful misbehavior. It was a manifestation of trauma. We had to rethink discipline, reimagine the way we did discipline. All of that sort of seems to me to fit very nicely with the idea of mental models. So maybe what our further work will be sort of joining our findings and seeing where they fit in that larger body of literature on school and process change.
In our small group, we spent a lot of time talking about that shared understanding and that shared belief system, and how it was really distinctively different from buy-in, because we kind of had buy-in as an early stage, like, okay, like, I get why we're having this, this is important, but just the deep internalizing of the why was so significant. And that's why we wanted a code like a shared understanding, a shared belief system, because it just felt more impactful than buy-in, because it was so deeply motivating and driving for understanding the why and how it related to the whole system.
It makes a lot of sense. Any final thoughts, questions, comments, critique?
I do want to thank Joe and Sal for being amazing mentors, great leaders, extremely patient throughout this whole process. So I want to make sure that we recognize Sal and Joe. Also, Patricia, Merlin, all of the actors who have kind of facilitated this process for us and this opportunity for all of us. I want to make sure that that they are also recognized. So thank you to all of you.
And Amy's saying, indeed, congratulations to the LIFS leadership team. So thank you for that. Okay, well, job well done. And obviously this scratches the surface for us. Our plan will be to be, recruiting another group of fellows and associates